Welcome to Life Confessions TV. Try to relax and feel the story.
5 years ago, I thought I had the perfect life. My name is Natalie Brooks, and back then I believed my marriage to Daniel Carter was built on trust. We met when I was 27. He was charming, confident, and always talking about big plans for the future. Daniel worked in real estate sales, and he loved to tell people that he would one day own his own development company. I believed him. Actually, I believed everything he said. 2 years after we met, we got married. A year later, we bought our first house together in Austin, Texas. At least, that's what I thought. The house was beautiful. 2 stories, a small backyard with a wooden deck, and a kitchen that I completely fell in love with. The mortgage was expensive, but I helped with the down payment. I put $85,000 of my own savings into that house, money I had saved for nearly 10 years. At the time, Daniel promised me something. "This house is the start of our future," he said. "Our investment, our security." I trusted him. And for a while, everything seemed normal. We both worked hard. We both paid bills. And every Sunday, Daniel's mother, Margaret Carter, came over for dinner. Margaret was complicated.
She always had something to say about me, about my job.
About my clothes, about the way I cooked. But Daniel always brushed it off. "That's just how she is," he would say. So I tried to ignore it. But there was one thing about Margaret that always bothered me. She was extremely involved in Daniel's finances. Sometimes she would ask questions that felt strange. "How much did Natalie contribute to the house? Whose name is on the paperwork? How are you splitting the mortgage?" At the time, I assumed she was just curious. Looking back now, I realized she was checking something. 3 years passed, and during those years, I worked harder than ever. I was a financial analyst at a tech company. I often worked late nights, sometimes weekends, but I didn't mind because I believed we were building something together. Daniel kept talking about starting his own company, a real estate consulting business. He said he just needed time, so I supported him. Emotionally, financially, and sometimes completely blindly. Then one evening, everything changed. It happened on a Thursday. I came home early from work. Daniel's car wasn't in the driveway, but Margaret's car was, which was strange, because Daniel wasn't home. I walked inside quietly. I could hear voices coming from the kitchen. Margaret was speaking, and her tone sounded serious. "I'm just saying," she said, "if things ever go wrong, you need to protect yourself." Daniel sighed. "Mom, it's fine." "No," she replied sharply. "You did the right thing putting the house in my name." My heart stopped. I froze in the hallway. Daniel lowered his voice. "Natalie doesn't know." Margaret laughed softly. "Well, she doesn't need to." The room felt like it started spinning. I stood there, barely breathing, trying to process what I had just heard. Putting the house in her name? That couldn't be right. I had signed paperwork. I had transferred money. I had gone through the mortgage process. There was no way the house wasn't ours, right? Then Daniel said something that made my stomach drop. "If Natalie ever decides to leave, she gets nothing." Margaret replied calmly. "Exactly." That's when I realized something. The house I thought we owned together was never mine, and possibly never even his. That night, I pretended I hadn't heard anything. When Daniel came home later, I acted completely normal. I cooked dinner. We talked about work. We watched television. But inside, my mind was racing. Was it possible? Could Daniel really have put the house in his mother's name without telling me? I barely slept that night. The next morning, while Daniel was in the shower, I opened my laptop. As a financial analyst, I knew exactly where to start. County property records. In Texas, those documents are public. I typed in our address. The page loaded, and then I saw it. Owner, Margaret Elaine Carter. My hands started shaking. The purchase date was the same date Daniel and I supposedly bought the house. But the buyer listed wasn't Daniel, and it definitely wasn't me. It was Margaret. My chest tightened. That meant one thing. Daniel had lied to me from the very beginning. The house was never ours. I closed the laptop slowly. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like I didn't know the man I married. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to everything. Daniel's conversations, his finances, his habits. And the more I looked, the more things stopped making sense. For example, the mortgage payments I thought we were making, they were actually being transferred to Margaret's account. Every month, Daniel told me it was the bank, but it wasn't. Another thing, the property tax statements, they were addressed to Margaret. I just never noticed before, because Daniel always grabbed the mail first. The more I investigated, the angrier I became.
Not just because of the house.
But because of the betrayal. I had invested $85,000 into something that legally wasn't mine. Daniel had taken my savings and used them to buy a house for his mother. Without telling me, without asking me, and worst of all, they had planned it together. Margaret knew. She had always known. For a few days, I considered confronting Daniel.
But something stopped me.
My instincts. Because if Daniel was capable of lying about something this big, then confronting him immediately would only make him more careful. Instead, I decided to do something else. I started gathering information. And that's when I discovered something very interesting. Margaret Carter owned more than just her house. She owned a small property management company. It was called Carter Property Solutions. Daniel had mentioned it before. He said it was just a small business. But when I started digging deeper, I realized something surprising. The company was struggling, really struggling. Their last public financial filings showed heavy debt, almost $420,000. If the company didn't find investors soon, it would likely go bankrupt. At that moment, an idea formed in my mind, and it was the kind of idea that slowly grows until it becomes impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, everything started to make sense. Daniel and Margaret thought they had protected themselves. They thought the house was safe. They thought I had no power. But what they didn't realize was something very simple. I worked in finance, and I knew exactly how companies like Margaret survived. They survived because someone, eventually,
Bought them.
and that's when I decided something. If Margaret wanted to take my house, then maybe I should take something from her too. Over the next 3 months, I played the role of the perfect wife. Daniel never suspected anything. I still cooked dinner. I still listened to his stories about work. I still smiled when Margaret came over on Sundays. But behind the scenes, I was planning something very different. Every night after Daniel went to sleep, I researched Carter Property Solutions. The deeper I looked, the clearer the situation became. Margaret's company managed rental properties for small landlords around Austin. But the company had serious problems. Late payments, maintenance lawsuits, and most importantly,
Debt.
a lot of debt. The company had borrowed money from several private lenders, and many of those loans were about to come due, which meant one thing: Margaret needed cash.
Fast.
Without it, the company would collapse. I also noticed something else. Margaret was currently negotiating with a potential investor, a man named Leonard Vaughn, a local businessman. He was considering investing $300,000 into Carter Property Solutions, but the deal wasn't finalized yet, which meant there was still time. So I did something Daniel and Margaret never imagined I would do. I contacted Leonard Vaughn myself. At first, he seemed confused. "Why are you calling me?" he asked. I kept my voice calm. "Because I believe you're about to invest in Carter Property Solutions." He paused. "That's still under consideration." "I know," I replied, "and I'd like to make you a better offer." There was silence on the phone. Then he said slowly, "I'm listening." I explained everything. The financial risks,
The debt.
the lawsuits, the declining contracts. But then I told him something else. "I'm interested in acquiring the company entirely." He sounded surprised. "You want to buy it?" "Yes. But Margaret Carter hasn't listed it for sale." I smiled slightly.
She will.
Leonard chuckled. "You sound very confident." "I work in finance," I said. "I know when a company is desperate, Another pause. Finally, he said, "What exactly are you proposing?" And that's when I told him, if he stepped away from the deal, I would buy the company instead, and I would make it worth his time. 2 weeks later, Leonard Vaughn officially withdrew from negotiations with Margaret, which caused a small panic inside Carter Property Solutions. And right on schedule, Margaret started searching for new investors. That's when I made my move. I contacted her directly. I introduced myself as a private investor, interested in struggling property management companies. Margaret didn't recognize my name. Why would she? I used my maiden name, Natalie Brooks, not Natalie Carter. When she agreed to meet, I almost laughed because she had no idea who she was about to negotiate with. And that meeting was the moment everything started falling apart for them. The meeting took place in Margaret's office, a small building near downtown Austin. I walked in wearing a dark blazer and carrying a folder full of documents. Margaret greeted me politely. She had no idea who I was. Not at first. "Ms. Brooks," she said, shaking my hand. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I replied. "I've reviewed your company's financials." Her smile stiffened slightly. "I'm sure you noticed we're in a temporary rough patch." Temporary. That was a generous way to describe it. But I kept my expression neutral. "I specialize in restructuring companies like yours." Margaret leaned forward. "What exactly are you offering?" I opened the folder slowly. "A full acquisition." Her eyebrows lifted. "You want to buy Carter Property Solutions?" "Yes." She hesitated. I wasn't planning to sell. I slid another document across the desk. A breakdown of her debt. Every loan, every deadline, every interest payment. Her eyes widened. "How did you get this information?" "It's public," I said calmly. "Mostly." Margaret stared at the papers for a long moment. Then she asked quietly, "What's your offer?" I told her, $250,000 for the entire company. At first, she looked offended. "That's far below its value." I nodded slightly. "Maybe 3 years ago." Then I pointed to another page. Projected bankruptcy risk. If her lenders demanded repayment, the company would collapse within months. Margaret knew it. I could see it in her face. Finally, she asked the question I was waiting for. "Why are you interested in this company?" I smiled. "Because I think it can be profitable again." The truth was, I didn't actually care about the company. I cared about something else. Something Margaret owned personally. Something tied to the company. The company headquarters building, which was also listed as collateral for several loans. And if I owned the company, I would control that property too. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "You're asking me to give up my entire business?" "Yes." She studied me carefully. "Why does this feel like I'm missing something?" For a moment, I almost told her. Almost. But instead, I just said, "Because you're running out of time." 3 days later, Margaret Carter signed the sale agreement. And just like that, I became the owner of Carter Property Solutions. But the real surprise came a week later, at a family dinner, because that was the moment Daniel finally discovered who had bought his mother's company. The following Sunday, Daniel and I went to Margaret's house for dinner, just like we always did. Margaret looked exhausted. Daniel noticed it too. "Everything okay with the company?" he asked. She sighed. "I had to sell." Daniel looked shocked. "What?" Margaret rubbed her temples. "A private investor bought Carter Property Solutions." Daniel frowned. "Who?" Margaret shook her head. "Some woman named Natalie Brooks." Daniel froze. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. I set down my glass and smiled. "Yes," I said calmly. "That would be me." The room went completely silent. Margaret stared at me, her face turning pale. "You?" Daniel looked like he had been punched in the stomach. "What are you talking about?" I folded my hands on the table. "I bought your mother's company last week." Margaret stood up suddenly. "You tricked me?" "No," I replied calmly. "You just didn't recognize my maiden name." Daniel's voice shook. "Natalie, what is going on?" I looked directly at him. "Remember the house? His face drained of color. The silence that followed was almost painful. "You heard that conversation," he whispered. "Yes." Margaret looked furious. "You had no right." "No right," I interrupted. "I invested $85,000 into a house that legally belonged to you." Neither of them spoke. I continued calmly. "So, I decided to make a new investment." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "You bought the company just to get revenge?" I shrugged slightly. "Not exactly." Margaret's voice trembled. "What do you mean?" I reached into my bag and pulled out another document. The new company structure. Since Carter Property Solutions owned the office building, and Daniel worked there as a consultant, that meant something interesting. I slid the paper toward Daniel. He read the top line. Then his hands started shaking, because at the top it said, "Owner, Natalie Brooks." And below that, "Employee, Daniel Carter." His voice cracked. "You're my boss." I nodded. "Yes." Margaret looked furious. "You can't do this." But I calmly stood up. "I already did." Then I added one final sentence. "Oh, and Daniel?" He looked up slowly. "If you're late to work tomorrow, you're fired." And for the first time in 5 years, I felt completely in control of my own life. Because the house they tried to take from me, I no longer cared about it. Now, I own something much more valuable: their future. If you enjoyed this story, tell me in the comments. What would you have done in my place? And if you like stories about betrayal, revenge, and shocking twists, make sure to subscribe to Life Confessions TV and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even crazier.